The first warning didn't come from a monitor, a medical chart, or a frightened keeper. It came from Mason, the massive silverback who had spent years greeting every sunrise with calm confidence until the morning he looked at his own newborn and quietly stepped backward as if an invisible line had suddenly appeared between them. Inside the primate habitat at Cedar Ridge Wildlife Park, the birth had been expected to become the happiest moment of the season. Families had gathered outside the viewing windows. Volunteers whispered excitedly over fresh coffee, and head keeper Daniel Brooks checked every detail with the confidence that came from 20 years of caring for great apes. Mason had always been known as the steady guardian of the troop, never reckless, never unpredictable, always the first to settle tension with nothing more than a watchful stare. That was why no one understood what happened next. The newborn rested safely beside its exhausted mother, breathing softly while the troop remained unusually quiet, almost as if every animal in the enclosure sensed something the humans could not. Daniel expected Mason to move closer within seconds, perhaps to study the infant from a respectful distance before returning to his family. Instead, the silverback froze. His broad shoulders stiffened. His eyes never left the tiny newborn, yet he refused to take another step forward. One slow step backward became two, then three. He lowered his head, released a deep rumble that echoed through the habitat, and positioned himself near the far wall without breaking eye contact for even a heartbeat. Visitors assumed the giant ape was nervous. Some children pressed their hands against the glass, asking why the father looked afraid. Others wondered if he simply didn't recognize the baby. Daniel had seen dozens of gorilla births over the years, but nothing about this reaction fit anything he had witnessed before. He quietly radioed for Dr. Olivia Carter, the park's senior veterinarian, asking her to come immediately. By the time she arrived with young keeper Chloe Reed, the atmosphere had changed in ways no one could explain. The mother remained protective but surprisingly calm. The newborn barely moved except for gentle breaths. Mason had not shown a single sign of aggression, yet he refused every opportunity to approach, even when the mother shifted slightly to create space for him. Dr. Carter watched silently for nearly a minute before saying something that unsettled everyone standing nearby. "He's not avoiding the baby," she whispered. "He's avoiding something else." Daniel frowned. There was nothing else to avoid. The habitat was secure. The morning health checks had been normal. Every camera showed the same peaceful scene. Yet Mason's expression carried an urgency impossible to ignore, as though every instinct inside him was demanding that he stay exactly where he was. Then, without warning, the enormous silverback slowly lifted one hand toward the newborn, stopped inches above the ground, clenched his fingers into a tight fist, and pulled his arm back again while staring directly at Dr. Carter, leaving the veterinarian with the chilling feeling that Mason wasn't rejecting his newborn at all. He was desperately trying to stop the humans from making a mistake they hadn't even discovered yet. Mason remained exactly where he had stopped, his enormous frame motionless except for the slow rise and fall of his breathing. And although the visitors outside the glass gradually drifted away after the excitement of the birth faded, he never relaxed his watch over the tiny newborn resting beside its mother. Daniel had always believed he understood the silverback better than anyone. Over the last 12 years, he had watched Mason settle arguments within the troop without unnecessary force, gently guide younger gorillas away from danger, and patiently wait for elderly members to finish eating before approaching the feeding area himself. He had seen Mason comfort frightened juveniles during thunderstorms by simply sitting beside them in silence. He had even watched the great ape spend nearly an hour retrieving a favorite blanket that had blown into the corner of the habitat for one of the younger gorillas that refused to sleep without it. Nothing in Mason's history suggested fear, rejection, or indifference toward his family. That contradiction weighed heavily on everyone who knew him. Chloe quietly reviewed old observation logs while Dr. Olivia Carter stood outside the habitat with folded arms, refusing to jump to conclusions despite growing pressure from several staff members who wondered whether the father should be separated from the mother and infant. Olivia declined every suggestion. She kept returning to the same thought. Mason had not acted like an animal avoiding responsibility. He looked more like someone carrying a burden nobody else could see. Throughout the afternoon, the newborn shifted only occasionally, making the soft sounds expected from a healthy infant, while the mother carefully groomed the baby's tiny arms and face. Every few minutes, she glanced toward Mason as though waiting for him to come closer, but he answered only with unwavering eye contact before lowering his head again. The distance between father and child remained exactly the same, almost measured with painful precision. Daniel noticed another detail that unsettled him even more. Mason refused every favorite treat the keepers offered. Fresh grapes, sliced apples, sweet potatoes, even the roasted peanuts he usually accepted immediately remained untouched on the platform. Instead, the silverback stayed alert, barely blinking, listening to every tiny movement inside the habitat. As evening approached, the park closed to visitors, leaving only the quiet sounds of ventilation fans and distant maintenance carts. Chloe dimmed the observation lights to help the troop settle for the night, but Mason did not lie down. Hour after hour he stayed awake, watching without moving closer. Shortly after midnight, Daniel returned for another routine check and expected exhaustion to have finally overcome the giant silverback. Instead, he found Mason standing in the exact same place, shoulders tense, eyes fixed on the newborn. Then something almost too subtle to notice happened. The baby stretched one tiny hand into the air for only a second before falling still again, and at that exact moment Mason slowly closed his eyes, released the quietest, saddest rumble Daniel had ever heard from him, and took one careful step farther. Away. Morning arrived with the quiet rhythm that usually brought the gorilla troop back to normal, yet nothing about Mason felt normal anymore. Instead of remaining in one place as he had through the night, the silverback began following a strange pattern that none of the keepers had ever recorded before. Every few minutes, he slowly walked the exact same wide circle around the outer edge of the habitat, always stopping at 4 identical spots as though invisible markers had been placed there. At each stop, he briefly lowered his head toward the ground, listened without touching anything, then continued to the next position with deliberate precision. Daniel watched the security footage several times, measuring the distance between each stop. Every loop matched the previous one within inches. It was too exact to be random. Chloe quietly suggested that perhaps Mason was stressed by becoming a father, but even she sounded unconvinced. Stress usually made gorillas restless or withdrawn. Mason looked neither. He looked focused. Stranger still, he carefully avoided crossing through the center of the enclosure where the newborn rested with its mother, choosing instead to travel the longest possible route every single time. Visitors who returned that morning noticed the unusual routine almost immediately. Some whispered that the silverback appeared frightened of his own family. Others wondered whether he had become confused or was developing unusual behavior with age. Daniel politely answered every question while hiding the growing concern on his own face. Dr. Olivia remained silent, standing beside the observation window with a notebook that stayed almost completely blank because every explanation she considered failed to fit what she was seeing. Around noon, the youngest gorilla in the troop wandered playfully toward Mason carrying a small bundle of fresh leaves. Normally, Mason welcomed the youngster with gentle patience, but this time he calmly intercepted the juvenile several feet before the center of the habitat, took the leaves without eating them, carried them to the opposite side, and carefully placed them against the far wall before allowing the younger gorilla to continue. Less than 5 minutes later, another member of the troop unknowingly carried a branch toward the same area near the newborn. Mason repeated the exact behavior. No aggression, no panic, simply removing anything that entered that invisible boundary. By late afternoon, the keepers began noticing objects accumulating where Mason had placed them. Leaves, twigs, enrichment toys, blankets, even an empty feeding bucket that had accidentally rolled across the enclosure had all been relocated to the same distant corner. Daniel frowned as he studied the growing pile. Mason was not collecting food. He was not building a nest. He seemed to be clearing space around only one location, yet no one understood why. Chloe suggested checking every inch of the habitat for hidden hazards, but maintenance crews found nothing unusual. The flooring was solid, the barriers secure, and the environmental sensors showed perfect readings. Even so, Mason continued his silent routine without missing a single circuit. Then, just before sunset, Dr. Olivia witnessed the moment that made every person in the observation room fall completely silent. The newborn let out a soft cry, and before the mother could even react, Mason rushed forward faster than anyone had seen all day. For one hopeful second, it looked as though he had finally decided to embrace his child. Instead, he stopped exactly 3 feet away, gently turned his own back toward the infant, spread both massive arms wide, as if shielding something no human could see, and remained perfectly still while staring directly at the empty space behind the baby. The image of Mason standing with his back toward the newborn spread through the staff faster than any official report ever could, and by sunrise almost everyone at Cedar Ridge Wildlife Park had formed the same heartbreaking conclusion. They did not believe he wanted to hurt the baby. They believed something inside him had simply changed. Daniel fought against that idea, replaying the surveillance footage again and again, searching for the patient silverback he had known for more than a decade. But each viewing only deepened the confusion. Mason was no longer behaving like the dependable leader who instinctively strengthened the troop. He appeared to be deliberately isolating himself from the very family he had always protected. Even worse, the mother had begun responding to his unusual distance. Instead of encouraging him to approach, she quietly gathered the newborn closer whenever he completed another slow circuit around the habitat, as though she could no longer understand what he was trying to communicate. Chloe noticed the subtle change first and whispered that perhaps the troop itself was beginning to lose confidence in its leader. That possibility weighed heavily on everyone because gorilla families depended on stability, and uncertainty could quietly spread from one individual to another. Dr. Olivia refused to label Mason's behavior as aggression, yet she also admitted she could no longer describe it as normal. During a meeting with the veterinary staff and park management, difficult questions replaced hopeful ones. What if Mason's unusual behavior continued for days? What if the mother became increasingly stressed? What if the newborn failed to develop naturally because the family bond had already been disrupted? None of those concerns sounded unreasonable. In fact, each one reflected years of professional experience. That was what made the situation so painful. Nobody wanted to judge Mason unfairly. They believed they were trying to protect the young family before the emotional distance grew worse. Daniel quietly reminded everyone that Mason had never shown hostility toward another gorilla, never endangered a keeper, and never ignored his responsibilities before this week. His words filled the room with silence, but they could not erase the evidence unfolding in front of everyone's eyes. Every hour the separation continued, confidence in the silverback faded a little more. Outside the conference room, Mason remained exactly as the cameras showed him, repeating his careful routine without a single sign of frustration. Several times he looked toward the observation windows where Daniel often stood, almost as though he expected the familiar keeper to understand something no one else could see. Daniel wanted to believe there was still a reason behind every strange movement, yet even he found himself wondering whether love alone was preventing him from accepting an obvious truth. By late afternoon, the park director arrived with a recommendation supported by both administrative policy and veterinary protocol. The newborn and its mother would be moved into a neighboring protected habitat for continuous observation, while Mason would remain alone until specialists could determine whether his behavior represented an emotional disturbance that might affect the stability of the troop. Daniel lowered his eyes as the authorization papers were placed on the table. Dr. Olivia hesitated with the pen in her hand longer than anyone expected, but after another long glance at the live monitor, she slowly reached forward, knowing that once her signature touched the page, the team would begin preparing to separate Mason from his family before sunrise. Dr. Olivia could not bring herself to sign the final authorization before completing one last routine review of the medical records, not because she expected to find anything unusual, but because years of experience had taught her that the smallest unanswered question often became the largest mistake. Daniel remained beside her in the veterinary office while Chloe quietly organized the files collected during the previous 48 hours. Every chart appeared reassuring. The newborn's heart rate stayed within the expected range. Body temperature remained stable. Breathing looked consistent. Nothing justified delaying the planned separation. Even so, Olivia felt an uncomfortable hesitation she could not explain. Before closing the digital record, she opened the environmental monitoring log simply to confirm that every reading inside the habitat had remained normal throughout the birth. Temperature, humidity, and air quality all appeared exactly where they should have been. Then one line caught her attention. It was a routine infrared surface map generated every 30 minutes to help monitor sleeping locations during the night. Normally nobody paid attention to it because it existed only to verify heating systems. Olivia enlarged the image almost absent-mindedly. The colored outline showed warm areas where each gorilla had rested. The mother's position matched expectations. The younger gorillas formed familiar clusters. Mason's repeated path created the wide circle Daniel had already documented. But something else appeared inside the cleared space surrounding the newborn. A faint oval patch remained consistently several degrees cooler than every nearby surface despite different readings taken throughout the day. Olivia frowned. The heating system beneath that section of flooring had passed inspection only a week earlier. Daniel leaned closer and suggested it was probably a sensor error, yet Olivia quietly overlaid 6 consecutive maps. The cool patch never moved. More surprising still, Mason's strange walking pattern always stopped just outside its edge, as though he had somehow measured a boundary no instrument had highlighted for the staff. Chloe searched additional maintenance reports and discovered that technicians had recalibrated the infrared sensors twice during the previous month because they believed one section kept reporting incorrect temperatures. They eventually dismissed the issue after finding nothing physically wrong. Olivia stared at the screen for several silent seconds. If the sensors were truly malfunctioning, Mason's behavior should have been meaningless coincidence. But if the readings were accurate, then the silverback had been avoiding the exact same location long before anyone noticed the irregularity. Daniel slowly replayed the habitat footage while comparing it with the thermal map. Every circuit aligned perfectly. Every pause occurred within inches of the invisible border surrounding the cooler area. None of it proved Mason understood anything unusual, yet for the first time the evidence pointed away from emotional rejection and toward deliberate caution. Olivia felt the weight of the unsigned authorization papers resting beside her hand. She closed the folder without touching the pen. Instead, she picked up the phone and instructed the imaging department to prepare portable diagnostic equipment immediately. The planned separation would wait. Before anyone moved the newborn or questioned Mason again, she wanted a complete examination performed from the beginning, including a second ultrasound that would investigate every detail they might have overlooked the first time. The portable ultrasound unit arrived before sunrise, and although the original examination had shown nothing alarming, Dr. Olivia insisted that every image be captured again from different angles before anyone separated the little family. Daniel remained uneasy as the veterinary team carefully prepared the newborn while the mother stayed calm nearby, never taking her eyes off the tiny infant. Mason, however, reacted the moment the equipment entered the habitat entrance. Instead of retreating into his familiar circuit, he walked directly to the invisible boundary he had respected for 2 days and stopped there without crossing it. He did not challenge the staff. He did not interfere. He simply stood perfectly still, his entire attention fixed on the examination as though he had been waiting for this exact moment. Olivia began the scan expecting another routine confirmation, but within seconds she paused. The image looked normal until she adjusted the depth settings one final time. A faint shadow appeared beneath the newborn's diaphragm, so subtle that it blended almost perfectly with surrounding tissue during the earlier examination. Believing it was only interference, she changed the probe angle again. The shadow remained. She enlarged the image, then switched to another frequency. This time the outline became unmistakable. It was not an injury, and it was not a developmental abnormality. A small pocket of trapped air had formed in an unusual position after birth, gently pressing against nearby organs whenever the infant's body shifted in certain directions. It explained why the baby remained comfortable while resting in one position, but could become distressed if handled too quickly or pressed the wrong way. The condition was uncommon, difficult to detect during a routine scan, and likely to resolve with careful monitoring instead of emergency treatment. But unnecessary handling during the first hours could have complicated the recovery. Olivia felt her heartbeat quicken as another realization struck her. She pulled up the thermal maps from the previous day and overlaid them beside the ultrasound images. The cooler patch on the habitat floor matched the only area where the newborn had naturally settled into the position that reduced pressure inside its tiny body. Every time the mother shifted away from that spot, Mason had quietly redirected the space around the infant without ever touching the baby himself. He had removed branches, blankets, toys, and even curious troop members so nothing would disturb that narrow area. He had refused to approach not because he rejected his child, but because his enormous size could accidentally encourage movement before the newborn was ready. Even the strange moment when he turned his back toward the infant now carried a completely different meaning. He had not been ignoring the baby. He had been creating a living barrier that discouraged everyone else from stepping closer. Daniel slowly replayed every memory from the past 2 days, each painful misunderstanding collapsing beneath the weight of the new evidence. Chloe covered her mouth, unable to believe that the behavior everyone had mistaken for emotional distance had actually been extraordinary restraint. Olivia lowered the ultrasound probe with trembling hands and looked through the observation glass toward Mason. The silverback remained exactly where he had always chosen to stand, calm, patient, and watchful. For the first time since the birth, no one in the room saw a confused father. They saw a parent who had recognized a fragile truth long before any machine had revealed it, and the silence that filled the veterinary suite carried only one unbearable realization. They had been preparing to take his family away from him while he had been trying to protect them all along. No one spoke for several long seconds because every explanation they had repeated over the past 2 days had quietly fallen apart. Daniel looked through the observation glass at Mason and felt a weight settle in his chest that years of experience had never prepared him for. He remembered every moment he had interpreted as emotional distance. The careful circles, the untouched food, the growing pile of blankets and branches, the invisible line the silverback never crossed. None of it had been fear. None of it had been rejection. Mason had been making impossible choices every minute, resisting the instinct to rush toward his own newborn because some deeper awareness told him that protecting the infant meant staying back. Daniel slowly folded the unsigned separation papers in half before tearing them into small pieces and dropping them into the recycling bin without taking his eyes off the habitat. Chloe stood beside him holding the observation notebook she had filled with worried comments about Mason's behavior. One by one she read the entries again, but every sentence now carried a completely different meaning. What she had labeled avoidance had actually been restraint. What she had described as emotional withdrawal had been patience beyond anything she believed an animal could possess. Instead of crossing out her notes, she carefully added one sentence beneath every page. We misunderstood him. Dr. Olivia quietly removed the separation order from the medical file and replaced it with a new care plan centered on minimizing unnecessary movement around the newborn until the tiny pocket of trapped air naturally resolved. She instructed every staff member to preserve the same resting position Mason had silently protected from the beginning. Nobody questioned the decision. The veterinary team adjusted the soft bedding exactly where the thermal map had indicated, reduced activity around the enclosure, and postponed every non-essential examination. Even the maintenance crew delayed routine cleaning near the family to avoid disturbing the calm environment Mason had been trying to preserve all along. Outside, visitors noticed that the keepers had become unusually quiet. Instead of explaining Mason's behavior with confident answers, Daniel simply invited them to watch patiently. The silverback remained at his familiar position, alert but peaceful, as though he sensed the pressure surrounding his family had finally begun to disappear. Late that afternoon, the newborn shifted comfortably before settling back into the same protected spot. For the first time since the birth, Mason's shoulders slowly relaxed. It was only a slight change, barely noticeable unless someone had been watching him for hours, yet Daniel recognized it immediately. The enormous gorilla no longer looked burdened by the fear that nobody understood him. He looked hopeful. Chloe felt tears gathering but did not look away. She realized the greatest lesson had not come from the ultrasound. It had come from Mason's quiet refusal to abandon his instincts even when every human around him believed he was wrong. Daniel finally picked up the radio and calmly informed the entire park that the family would remain together, all transfer preparations were canceled, and every future decision regarding the newborn would follow the updated veterinary plan built around the evidence Mason had been showing them from the very beginning. As the message echoed through the facility, everyone understood that their next responsibility was no longer to protect the baby from Mason, but to protect Mason's family with the same patience and trust he had shown them first. The changes began with quiet decisions that no visitor would ever notice, yet to Mason they transformed the entire world around his family. Dr. Olivia redesigned the newborn's care schedule so every examination happened only when truly necessary, allowing long stretches of uninterrupted rest inside the exact area the silverback had guarded since the first day. Daniel worked with the keepers to remove unnecessary equipment from the habitat entrance, reducing unfamiliar movement that might disturb the troop. Chloe carefully rearranged enrichment items so nothing rolled or drifted toward the protected space Mason had kept clear with such remarkable patience. Instead of trying to change the silverback's behavior, the staff finally chose to learn from it. During the following morning, something equally remarkable happened. Mason abandoned the perfect circles he had repeated countless times over the previous days. He still watched carefully, but his path gradually became shorter, his pauses less frequent, as though an invisible weight had begun lifting from his shoulders. The mother noticed the change before anyone else. Without hesitation or uncertainty, she gently shifted a few inches closer to him, while keeping the newborn comfortably settled in the position recommended by Dr. Olivia. No keeper encouraged the movement. No one interrupted. Everyone simply observed in respectful silence. Daniel quietly closed the observation log and decided not to write for a while. He realized that every important moment did not need to be measured, timed, or categorized. Some moments deserved only gratitude. Throughout the afternoon, the atmosphere inside the habitat felt different. The younger gorillas resumed playful routines they had quietly abandoned during the days of confusion. Curious birds returned to the nearby trees. Even the visitors sensed a calm they could not explain, speaking more softly as they watched the family from behind the glass. Mason continued monitoring every small movement around the newborn, but the urgency that had once defined his posture slowly gave way to confidence. Then, just before sunset, the tiny infant stretched again, this time with greater strength than before. The little hand rested briefly against the soft bedding before relaxing naturally. Mason watched without moving. Several long seconds passed. The newborn remained peaceful. Dr. Olivia glanced at the latest ultrasound images and smiled with quiet relief. The trapped air pocket had already begun resolving exactly as expected. No intervention beyond careful observation would be necessary. Daniel looked back toward Mason just as the silverback finally made the choice everyone had hoped for, but nobody dared expect. Instead of approaching the baby directly, he slowly lowered himself onto the ground a comfortable distance away and rested one broad hand against the earth between himself and his family. He stayed there without reaching farther, allowing the newborn complete safety while offering calm reassurance through nothing more than his presence. The mother responded by gently settling into a relaxed posture she had not shown since the birth, closing her eyes for the first uninterrupted rest anyone had seen her take. No barrier separated them anymore except the space Mason himself had wisely respected. Daniel quietly turned off the portable monitoring alarm that had sounded every hour since the delivery. The enclosure became wonderfully still. In that peaceful silence, Mason released one deep, gentle rumble unlike any the keepers had heard before. It was not a warning, not a signal, and not a cry for help. It was the sound of a father who finally understood that the humans around him had begun to understand him too, and for the first time since the newborn entered the world, he allowed himself to rest. Over the following weeks, the newborn grew stronger exactly as Dr. Olivia had predicted. Each new ultrasound confirmed that the tiny pocket of trapped air had disappeared naturally, leaving behind nothing except a remarkable lesson that no medical report could fully capture. The keepers slowly returned the habitat to its normal routine, but one change remained forever. Daniel asked the staff to preserve a copy of the thermal maps, observation notes, and revised care plan in the training archive for every future veterinarian and keeper who joined Cedar Ridge Wildlife Park. At the top of the file, he added a single sentence instead of a technical summary. Observe longer before you decide. New employees often paused when they reached those words, and Daniel would quietly tell them the story of a father who had protected his newborn without asking for trust, praise, or recognition. Chloe never erased the notebook she had filled during those difficult days. She kept every original page, including every mistaken conclusion she had written before the truth emerged. Rather than hiding her errors, she used them while mentoring young wildlife interns, reminding them that experience alone could never replace humility. Dr. Olivia also changed one of the hospital's long-standing procedures. Whenever an unusual behavior appeared after a birth, the team would no longer ask only what was medically wrong. They would also ask what the animal might already understand that the humans had not yet discovered. Months later, visitors standing outside the observation glass often smiled as they watched the healthy young gorilla explore the habitat with fearless curiosity. Mason no longer kept his careful distance. Instead, he quietly remained nearby, never interrupting the little one's adventures, but always close enough that reassurance could be found with a single glance. The remarkable part was not that he became an affectionate father after the danger had passed. It was that he had been one from the very first moment, even when nobody recognized what love looked like. Sometimes the youngster would wander toward the same open space that had once been carefully protected, pause for a brief second, and then continue happily across the enclosure while Mason calmly watched from beneath the shade of a tall oak. Daniel often found himself standing at the observation window after the park closed, remembering how close they had come to separating a family that had never truly been broken. He no longer saw those painful days as a professional failure. He saw them as a permanent reminder that wisdom does not always speak through words, instruments, or procedures. Sometimes it stands quietly in front of us, asking only for the patience to be understood. Before leaving each evening, Daniel would look one last time toward the gorilla habitat, where Mason rested peacefully beside his family, no longer carrying the burden of proving himself to anyone. The silence between them had become trust, and the trust had become home. The deepest instinct is not the one that acts first. It is the one that waits until love is truly understood.